Perhaps no name struck more terror into the hearts of outlaws than Michael Angel of Death Callahan, a man whose very name once made hardened killers cross themselves in terror. A former Union cavalry officer turned merciless manhunter, credited with sending 34 men to their graves, who once coldly stated, "I don't hunt criminals, I pass judgment." Now, 20 years later, the residents of peaceful Silver Creek know him only as their aging sheriff Mike Collins, a quiet lawman approaching retirement. But when the ruthless Blake gang threatens his town, they're about to learn that some legends don't fade. They just go to sleep for a while. Join me today as we delve into the story of how a band of outlaws learned the hard way that the deadliest predator is the one wearing a badge. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special lined up for you. Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, summer of 1885. The town nestled in a valley where the desert met the mountains, a place where the morning sun painted the adobe buildings in shades of gold and shadow. A single dusty main street ran its length, lined with the usual marks of frontier civilization: Whitman's General Store, the Silver Spur Saloon, Dr. Maxwell's office, and the simple wooden church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. It was the kind of place where most folks were too busy fighting the harsh land to cause trouble, which is exactly why Sheriff Mike Collins had chosen it 15 years ago. Those who'd known Collins during his tenure would describe him as firm but fair, a steady presence who preferred stern warnings to gunplay. His silver hair and weathered face had earned him the affectionate nickname Old Mike among the townsfolk, and children would often stop by his office for the peppermint sticks he kept in his desk drawer. Few could imagine those gentle hands had once dealt out death with terrifying precision across 3 territories. At 62, Collins cut an unremarkable figure in his worn leather vest and badge that had lost its shine years ago. His Colt Peacemaker rode low on his hip, almost like an afterthought, and his hands, though calloused from years of work, showed the slight tremor of advancing age. Every morning, he'd make his rounds with a slight limp, touching the brim of his hat to ladies and shopkeepers, stopping to exchange words with ranchers coming to town for supplies. Mayor Theodore Walsh, who'd hired him all those years ago, often praised Collins' ability to keep peace through wisdom rather than force. "That's what we need out here," he'd tell anyone who'd listen, "not some young hothead with a quick trigger finger." The mayor had no way of knowing that those aging hands had once been the fastest guns west of the Mississippi, or that the slight stoop in Collins' walk came from a bullet he'd taken bringing down the notorious Hawkins brothers in '65. Dr. Sarah Maxwell was perhaps the first to notice something different about their sheriff when treating him for a broken wrist after a fall from his horse. As she wrapped the injury, she couldn't help but observe the collection of old scars that no simple lawman should carry. Bullet wounds, knife marks, the kind of history written in flesh that spoke of a far more violent past. But like any good frontier doctor, she understood discretion, and the questions she didn't ask said more than any she could have voiced. The only person who might have recognized the truth was old John at the livery stable, himself a veteran of darker days. He'd seen the way Collins checked his gun each morning with practiced precision, how his eyes constantly scanned the street even on quiet days, noting strangers and watching shadows. But John kept his peace, understanding that some men earned the right to choose their own histories. The peace Collins had carefully maintained in Silver Creek was about to be shattered by the arrival of the Blake gang, 3 brothers and their followers who'd cut a bloody swathe across the territory. Led by Marcus Blake, a former Confederate cavalry officer turned outlaw, they'd left a trail of robbed banks and burned-out ranches in their wake. The youngest brother, Tommy, was known for his quick temper and quicker trigger finger, while the middle brother, James, had a reputation for calculating cruelty that made even hardened men uncomfortable. What they couldn't know was that their path to Silver Creek wasn't leading them to easy prey, but straight into the lair of a legend they thought long dead. A man who hadn't just enforced the law in his younger days. He'd been its terrifying embodiment, a shadow that haunted the nightmares of outlaws from Texas to California. As Sheriff Collins watched them ride into his town that scorching summer morning, something changed in his demeanor. The friendly old lawman seemed to fade away like morning mist, and those who stood nearby would later swear they saw something flash in those faded blue eyes, something cold and deadly like winter lightning in a dark sky. His aged hands no longer trembled as they rested near his gun, and his stooped shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. The legend of the Angel of Death was about to be reborn, and the Blake gang was about to learn why some legends are best left to rest in peace. The Blake gang rode into Silver Creek like a storm rolling across the desert, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that seemed to dim the morning sun. Marcus Blake led the column, his black duster and wide-brimmed hat cutting an imposing figure against the backdrop of adobe buildings. Behind him rode James and Tommy, flanked by 7 hardened outlaws whose very presence seemed to drain the color from the street. The townspeople melted away like morning dew, storekeepers quietly ushering customers inside, mothers calling children home, shoppers suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Only Sheriff Collins remained, standing on the wooden sidewalk outside his office, one hand resting casually on his gun belt while the other held a half-eaten apple. He appeared every bit the aging lawman, his badge dulled by years of desert sun, his silver hair catching the light beneath his weathered hat. Marcus Blake reined his horse to a stop in front of the sheriff's office, dust settling around them like a curtain. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he called down from his saddle, his voice carrying the refined edge of educated brutality. "Fine little town you've got here." His eyes, cold as mountain streams, studied Collins with the calculating interest of a wolf sizing up its prey. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Mr. Blake," Collins replied, taking another bite of his apple. The casual gesture made Tommy Blake's hand twitch toward his gun, but a sharp glance from Marcus held him in check. "News travels fast out here," the eldest Blake observed, swinging down from his horse with practiced grace. "It does indeed," Collins agreed mildly. "News of banks being robbed, ranches burned, good people killed." He took another bite, chewed thoughtfully. "Interesting thing about news, though, sometimes it doesn't tell the whole story." From his position by the saloon, Dr. Sarah Maxwell watched the exchange with growing concern. She'd treated enough gunshot wounds to recognize the tension in the air, the way both sides were measuring each other like boxers before a fight. But something about Collins' posture caught her attention, the slight shift in his stance, the way his fingers curled around the apple with the same precision they might grip a gun. James Blake, the middle brother, dismounted next, moving with the fluid grace of a mountain lion. His eyes darted around the street, noting positions, angles, potential cover. "Sheriff," he drawled, "way I hear it, you're getting on in years. Might be time to consider retirement, somewhere peaceful." The threat in his voice was as clear as a rattler's warning. Collins finished his apple, tossed the core aside with deliberate casualness. "Funny thing about retirement," he mused, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Man needs a reason to quit. Right now, I'm looking at 9 men who haven't given me one." Tommy Blake, still mounted, let out a harsh laugh. 9 against 1, old man. Those odds don't favor retirement age." His hand still hovered near his gun, young enough to be eager, too inexperienced to be wise. "Numbers are like news, son," Collins replied, his faded blue eyes meeting Tommy's fierce gaze. "They don't always tell the whole story either." Marcus Blake studied the old lawman with growing curiosity. There was something about his calm that didn't fit, like a puzzle piece that looked right but wouldn't quite settle into place. "We'll be staying in town a few days, Sheriff," he announced. "Just passing through, you understand. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings." "Only misunderstanding," Collins said softly, would be thinking Silver Creek is a town you want to pass through at all. For just a moment something flickered in those aged eyes, something that made even Marcus Blake's confident smile falter. Old John, watching from the livery stable doorway, saw it too. He'd served in the war, had seen men like Collins before, quiet men who carried death in their pocket like loose change, ready to spend it when the time came. He quietly began moving the more valuable horses to the back stable. "Much obliged for the welcome, Sheriff," Marcus said finally, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "We'll try to stay out of trouble." He turned to his men. "Boys, let's see what entertainment the Silver Spur has to offer." As the gang moved toward the saloon, James Blake lingered behind, studying Collins with the careful attention of a man who'd survived by noticing details. Something about the way the old sheriff held himself, the precise way his gun belt was worn. Inside the sheriff's office, Deputy Will Morgan watched through the window, his young face tight with worry. "Maybe we should send for help, Sheriff. The Rangers won't get here in time," Collins finished, finally moving from his spot on the sidewalk. He walked to his desk with measured steps, opened the bottom drawer, and removed an oiled cloth wrapped around something heavy. "Besides," he added quietly, "help isn't always about numbers." Unwrapping the cloth revealed a second Colt Peacemaker, its blued steel unmarked by age or wear. Unlike his duty weapon, this one showed signs of regular, meticulous care. As he checked the cylinder with practiced ease, his hands moved with a surety that belied their usual tremor. "Sir?" Morgan asked, noting the change in his mentor's demeanor. Collins looked up, and for a moment the young deputy saw something in those eyes that made him step back, something that spoke of dark trails and darker deeds, of justice dealt in lead and blood. "Will," the old sheriff said softly, "there's something you should know about your boss." The Silver Spur saloon hummed with nervous energy as the Blake gang settled in, claiming tables near the back wall where they could watch both the entrance and the street through dusty windows. Marcus Blake sat with his back to the corner, nursing a whiskey, while his cold eyes tracked every movement in the room. The usual afternoon crowd had thinned considerably, leaving only the bravest or most foolish patrons to share space with the notorious Outlaws. In the sheriff's office, Collins stood before his young deputy, the freshly oiled Peacemaker gleaming on his desk. 20 years ago," he began, his voice carrying the weight of buried memories, "there was a manhunter they called the Angel of Death. Union cavalry officer turned lawman. Had a reputation for tracking down the worst kinds of killers, men who'd given up their right to mercy." Will Morgan listened intently, his eyes darting between his mentor's face and the pristine gun on the desk. "I've heard stories," he said carefully. "They say he could track a man across bare rock, appear like a ghost in the night, never took prisoners, never showed mercy to true evil." "The story's got some things wrong," Collins replied, running a weathered finger along the Peacemaker's barrel. "Mercy isn't about weakness, Will. Sometimes the most merciful thing you can do is end a threat permanently." He looked up, and Morgan saw something in those faded blue eyes that made his spine straighten. "I didn't earn that name by being an angel." Before Morgan could respond, Dr. Sarah Maxwell burst through the office door, her face tight with concern. "Sheriff, they're threatening Samuel at the general store. James Blake and 3 others. They're shopping, they say, but they're breaking things, threatening to take whatever they want." Collins nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. "Will, stay here. Watch the street. Sarah." He paused, studying the doctor thoughtfully. "I suspect you'll have patience before sunset. Best prepare." At Whitman's general store, James Blake was amusing himself by systematically destroying Samuel Whitman's carefully arranged merchandise. The elderly shopkeeper stood helplessly behind his counter, watching as coffee tins were kicked across the floor and bags of flour were slashed open with knife blades. "Now see, Mr. Whitman," James drawled, running a finger through spilled sugar on a shelf. "A prosperous business like this ought to have some form of protection, times being what they are." He picked up a jar of honey, studied it in the light streaming through the windows. "Be a shame if accidents kept happening." The shop's door creaked open, the small bell above it chiming softly. Sheriff Collins stepped inside, still moving with the unhurried pace of an old man. His duty revolver remained in its holster, but his hand rested near it with casual familiarity. "Afternoon, boys," he said mildly. "Seems to me you're shopping wrong." James Blake turned slowly, a cold smile playing at his lips. "Sheriff, just having a conversation about business protection with Mr. Whitman here. Nothing that concerns the law." "Everything in Silver Creek concerns me," Collins replied. His voice remained gentle, but something in it made one of Blake's men step back involuntarily. "Now, way I see it, you boys have two choices. You can pay for the damages, apologize to Mr. Whitman, and walk out of here alive. Or—" He let the sentence hang. James Blake's smile widened. "Or what, old man? You'll arrest us? There's 4 of us, 1 of you, and I'm betting those hands shake too much to even draw that iron you're wearing." Collins didn't move, didn't even change expression, but something shifted in the air of the store. The temperature seemed to drop, despite the afternoon heat. "Funny thing about shaking hands," he said softly. "They steady right up when a man remembers who he used to be." Old John had slipped into the store during the exchange, positioning himself near the back door. He'd seen that look before during the war, the calm that came over certain men just before violence erupted. He quietly began ushering other customers toward the exit. "Used to be." James laughed, but there was a note of uncertainty in it now. "What were you, Sheriff? Some kind of hero?" "No," Collins replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Heroes show mercy. Angels of death don't." The words hung in the air for a moment before recognition dawned in James Blake's eyes. His hand dropped to his gun, but he never cleared leather. Collins moved with a speed that defied his age, his Colt seeming to materialize in his hand. 2 shots rang out, precise as a surgeon's cuts. James Blake's gun clattered to the floor, his right arm bleeding from a graze that had removed his ability to draw without taking his life. His nearest companion lay writhing, his shooting hand shattered by a bullet that could have just as easily taken his head. "That's 2 rounds, Collins said calmly, his gun unwavering. "I've got 4 more here and a fresh cylinder in my pocket. Anyone else want to test if the stories about the Angel of Death were exaggerated?" The remaining outlaws raised their hands slowly, the legendary name finally connecting to the old lawman before them. James Blake, cradling his wounded arm, stared at Collins with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You can't be... They said you died in 65. "Stories," Collins replied softly, "like shaking hands, aren't always what they seem." He raised his voice slightly. "Will, I know you're watching from across the street. Come help these boys find their way to our cells. Seems they need time to reconsider their business practices." Word of the shooting at Whitman's store spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, carried on whispers and worried glances. Marcus Blake sat in the Silver Spur, his expression darkening as his remaining men relayed the news about his brother James. The saloon had emptied completely now, even the bartender finding urgent business in the back room, leaving the gang leader alone with his thoughts and his younger brother Tommy. "The Angel of Death," Marcus repeated softly, rolling the legendary name around like a bitter taste in his mouth. "All these years, hiding in plain sight as a small-town sheriff." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Tommy, send riders to Cedar Junction and Black Rock. Tell Carson and Mackenzie we're calling in our markers. I want every gun they can spare." In his jail, Collins watched as Dr. Sarah Maxwell tended to James Blake's wound, her movements precise and professional despite the tension in the air. Deputy Morgan stood guard, his young face set in determined lines as he processed what he'd learned about his mentor. "You'll keep the arm," Sarah informed James clinically, "though your quick-draw days are likely over." She glanced at Collins, who stood by the window, watching the street with the patience of a mountain cat. "Unless you're planning to learn to shoot left-handed." James Blake said nothing, but his eyes never left Collins, studying him with a new understanding. The old lawman's transformation had been remarkable, the tremor in his hands gone, replaced by a steady sureness that spoke of countless gunfights. Even his posture had changed, the stoop of age giving way to the straight-backed bearing of a seasoned killer. 20 years ago," James said finally, breaking his silence, "you took down the Hawkins brothers. 3 men everyone said couldn't be killed. I was just a kid then, but I remember the stories. They said you appeared out of nowhere like God's own judgment." Collins turned from the window, his faded blue eyes meeting James's gaze. "God had nothing to do with it. The Hawkins brothers made their choice when they murdered that family in Tucson. I just helped them meet the consequences." "And now?" James asked, a hint of his former arrogance returning. "You're not the man you were 20 years ago. Marcus won't let this stand. He's got friends, connections, more men than you can handle alone. Your brother's pride will get more men killed," Collins replied softly, "just like yours did." He moved to his desk, opened the bottom drawer again. "Will, Sarah, you should know what we're dealing with. Might as well hear it from me before the stories start flying." He removed an old tin-type photograph, yellowed with age, showing a younger version of himself in a Union cavalry uniform. "After the war, I saw too many bad men taking advantage of the chaos. Killers hiding behind badges, outlaws pretending to be soldiers, all of them preying on good people trying to rebuild." His voice carried the weight of old memories. Someone had to hunt the hunters. Sarah finished bandaging James's arm, but stayed to listen, her medical bag forgotten in her lap. "The Angel of Death wasn't just a manhunter," she said quietly. "The stories say he was justice incarnate, that he could read a man's guilt in his eyes." Collins shook his head. "Stories grow bigger than truth out here. I was just a man who got very good at killing bad men. The angel part came from a habit of leaving a silver dollar on my victims, payment for the ferryman." He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, "though I did make sure they were guilty first." Outside, the afternoon was waning, painting the street in lengthening shadows. Old John watched from his livery stable as riders slipped out of town, heading east and west. Tommy Blake's messengers carrying calls for reinforcements. He made his way to the jail, his cavalry training still evident in his stride. "They're calling in the Carson gang from Cedar Junction," he reported without preamble. "Mackenzie's riders too, if I read the signs right. Could be looking at 30 men, maybe more." Collins nodded, unsurprised. "Marcus Blake always did think big. Problem is he thinks like a general, planning for armies. He checked his peacemaker with practiced ease. He doesn't understand that some battles are won by shadows and whispers, not numbers." Will Morgan, young face troubled, spoke up. "Sheriff, Mr. Collins." "Sir, shouldn't we send for help?" "The Rangers." "Won't get here in time," Collins finished. "Besides, too many witnesses make this kind of work messy." He turned to Sarah. "Doctor, you might want to set up a field hospital. Church basement would be best. Stone foundation, easily defended." "You're going to face them all?" Sarah asked, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Even the Angel of Death can't take on an army." Collins' eyes took on that distant look again, the one that spoke of dark trails and justice dealt in lead. "I won't have to. Half of them will run when they realize who they're facing. The other half—" He chambered around with a smooth, practiced motion. "The other half will learn why some legends are best left in the past." James Blake, watching from his cell, felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wound. He'd grown up hearing stories about the Angel of Death, But the reality was far more terrifying than any fireside tale. This wasn't just an old lawman remembering his glory days. This was a predator who'd simply been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to hunt again. As dusk settled over Silver Creek, the town transformed. Shutters closed quietly, doors were barred, and an eerie silence descended upon the streets. But behind those locked doors, preparation was underway. Collins had spent 15 years protecting these people. Now they were ready to stand with him, each in their own way. In the church basement, Dr. Sarah Maxwell organized her makeshift hospital with military precision. Her time as a field surgeon during the war had taught her to prepare for the worst. "Place the cots against the north wall," she directed volunteers. "Further from the windows, and we'll need more bandages." She paused, looking at the supplies thoughtfully. "Though knowing the Angel of Death's reputation, perhaps we should prepare more for the dead than the wounded." Mayor Theodore Walsh paced in Collins' office, his political instincts warring with his conscience. "Mike, Sheriff, perhaps we could negotiate. The Blakes might be willing to—" "They might," Collins interrupted softly, cleaning his second peacemaker with practiced care. "But I'm not." He looked up, and Walsh took an involuntary step back. The kind eyes of their aging sheriff had been replaced by something else. Something cold and absolute as mountain winter. "You're a good man, Theodore. That's why you look for peaceful solutions. But some men only understand one language." The mayor swallowed hard. "The stories about you. About what happened at Copper Canyon with the Hawkins brothers. Were they true?" Collins continued his methodical cleaning, his voice distant with memory. "Partly. They say I killed all 3 brothers in a straight fight. Truth is, I waited until night. Took Jacob Hawkins while he was filling his canteen. William died in his sleep, never knew what hit him. Only Samuel got to face me standing up." He looked at the mayor directly. "Stories talk about fair fights and quick-draw duels. Reality is, when you're hunting evil men, you use every advantage. In his cell, James Blake listened intently, understanding flowing through him like ice water. The legend of the Angel of Death wasn't about speed or skill with a gun. It was about the methodical, inevitable nature of judgment itself. Outside, Deputy Morgan worked with Old John and other veterans in town, following Collins' precise instructions. They removed certain planks from the boardwalk, adjusted hitching posts, and made subtle changes to the street that only experienced eyes would notice. The young deputy was beginning to understand. His mentor hadn't spent 15 years just keeping peace in Silver Creek. He'd been preparing the town itself as a weapon. "Your old man taught you well," Old John commented, noting Will's growing comprehension, though he probably never mentioned learning these tricks from the Angel of Death himself. At Morgan's surprised look, the old cavalryman smiled grimly. "Oh, yes, I knew who he was the moment he rode into town, served under him briefly during the war. Man had a way of turning terrain against the enemy, made the landscape itself into a trap." At the Silver Spur, Marcus Blake had gathered his remaining men, their faces illuminated by lamplight as he outlined his plan. "Carson's bringing 15 riders. Mackenzie promises at least 12. By noon tomorrow, we'll have enough guns to take this town apart, piece by piece." Tommy Blake, nursing his 3rd whiskey, looked troubled. "Marcus, if he really is the Angel of Death—" "He's an old man," Marcus snapped, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Whatever he used to be, time catches everyone. We just need to be smart about this. No more rushing in like James did." "Smart won't help you," a quiet voice said from the shadows. The outlaws spun, guns appearing in hands, to find Collins standing in the saloon's back entrance. None had heard him approach. "Numbers won't help you. Nothing will help you. Leave now, take your brother from my jail, and live. Stay." He left the threat unspoken. Marcus Blake's face flushed with rage and fear. "Shoot him!" he commanded. But Collins was already gone, seeming to melt into the darkness. The outlaws' bullets shattered bottles and splintered wood, but hit nothing else. "Ghost," one of the men whispered, his face pale. "He really is some kind of angel." "He's flesh and blood," Marcus insisted, but his voice shook slightly. "Flesh and blood can be killed." Back in his office, Collins stood at the window, watching the street with the patience of a man who had learned to wait for prey. Will Morgan joined him, his young face thoughtful. "You wanted them to see you," the deputy said slowly. "Wanted to shake their confidence." Collins nodded, pleased with his protégé's understanding. "Fear is a weapon, Will, more powerful than any gun. By morning, half those men will be jumping at shadows. The other half will be too busy watching the dark to watch each other's backs. And when Carson and Mackenzie arrive with reinforcements?" A cold smile touched Collins's lips, one that reminded Will of winter wolves. "They're coming from the east. They'll have the morning sun in their eyes when they ride in. Won't see the traps until it's too late. Won't see me at all." In the deepening night, Silver Creek waited. Behind locked doors, citizens prepared for what morning would bring. In the jail, James Blake stared at the ceiling, remembering childhood stories of an avenging angel who hunted wicked men. In the saloon, Marcus Blake tried to steady his nerves with whiskey while his men jumped at every creaking board, and somewhere in the darkness, the angel of death walked his town, setting his stage for the coming judgment. Tomorrow would remind the territory why some legends are whispered with fear, why some names make even hardened killers cross themselves in terror. The ghost of his past had awakened, and Silver Creek was about to become his hunting ground once more. Dawn broke over Silver Creek like a fever, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The morning brought with it the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Carson's men approaching from the east, just as Collins had predicted. The sound carried clearly in the desert air, a drumbeat of approaching violence that set the town's dogs to barking and brought anxious faces to carefully shuttered windows. In his office, Collins stood before his deputy, checking his weapons one final time. The transformation was complete now. No trace remained of the aging sheriff. In his place stood the angel of death, his movements precise and economical, his eyes cold as desert stars. "Remember what I taught you, Will," he said softly. "High ground is life. Windows are death unless you control the light, and never ever think you see me where I seem to be." Before Morgan could respond, old John burst through the door. "Carson's brought more than promised," he reported grimly. 23 riders, well armed. Mackenzie's group is coming in from the south. I count 15. They'll have us surrounded in 10 minutes. Collins nodded, unsurprised. "Tell Sarah to be ready. This won't be like the stories." He turned to Will. "Get to the church tower. When you see my signal, you know what to do." As Morgan hurried out, Sarah Maxwell appeared in the doorway, her medical bag clutched tightly. "Mike," she said softly, using his familiar name perhaps for the last time, "I've seen enough death in my life to know when a man's planning to deal it wholesale. Just remember you're not alone anymore. This isn't like the old days." A ghost of a smile touched Collins's lips. "No," he agreed, "it's not. Back then I was just hunting evil men. Today I'm protecting something worth fighting for." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That makes me far more dangerous." Outside, the morning sun had cleared the eastern hills when Carson's riders appeared on the main street, their horses' hooves stirring up clouds of golden dust. Jake Carson himself led them, a bear of a man with a face scarred by smallpox and a reputation for brutal efficiency. Behind him rode some of the most notorious guns in the territory, the Whitfield brothers, Copper Joe Martinez, and at least 4 men who had prices on their heads from Texas to California. Marcus Blake emerged from the Silver Spur to meet them, Tommy hovering nervously at his shoulder. "Carson," he greeted the newcomer. "Glad you could make it." Carson spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Heard you got yourself a problem with a legend." His eyes scanned the quiet street. "Though I'm having trouble believing the angel of death is hiding out here playing sheriff. Believing is about to become the least of your problems," a quiet voice said from everywhere and nowhere. The morning shadows seemed to shift, though the sun hadn't moved. Several horses nickered nervously, picking up their riders' sudden tension. "There!" one of Carson's men shouted, pointing toward a shadow near the general store. 3 riders opened fire, their bullets splintering wood and shattering a window. But the shadow was empty. "Amateur," the voice came again, this time seeming to drift from the opposite direction. "Shooting at shadows while death stands behind you." 2 more shots rang out, precise as a surgeon's cuts. 2 of Carson's men fell from their saddles, their gun hands shattered by bullets that could just as easily have taken their lives. The others spun their horses, firing wildly at empty air while their wounded companions screamed. "Jesus," Carson breathed, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "It really is him." High in the church tower, Will Morgan watched in awe as his mentor's strategy unfolded. Collins wasn't just fighting the outlaws, he was systematically destroying their nerve, using their own fear as a weapon. The deputy's hand tightened on the signal mirror he held, waiting for the moment his part would begin. Mackenzie's riders appeared from the south, right on schedule, but their arrival formation was ragged, already affected by the sounds of gunfire and screaming from the main street. Sean Mackenzie, a former Confederate guerrilla fighter, kept his men tight to the buildings, trying to minimize their exposure to the invisible shooter. "Find him!" Marcus Blake shouted, his composure cracking. "He's one man, one old man." Age, Colin's voice drifted from the shadows again, is such a useful deception, like patience, like mercy. Another shot cracked out, and Mackenzie's right-hand man pitched forward, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. "I'm being merciful now, teaching you slowly. That can change." In his jail cell, James Blake listened to the chaos outside, understanding flowing through him like ice water. The angel of death wasn't fighting a battle. He was conducting a symphony of fear, each shot a note in a crescendo of terror that would end only one way. "You can't hide forever," Carson roared, trying to rally his men. "We'll burn this town to the ground if we have to." The answer came not in words, but in action. The streets seemed to erupt as carefully prepared traps sprung, hitching posts collapsed, boardwalk planks gave way, and clouds of stinging dust rose from buried charges. In the confusion, 3 more outlaws fell to precisely placed shots, their weapons spinning away into the dirt. "Witchcraft," one of Mackenzie's men whispered, crossing himself. "He's made a deal with the devil." "No." Collins's voice came one final time, closer now. "The devil shows mercy sometimes. Angels of death don't. Angels—" The morning sun had fully cleared the hills now, and in its harsh light, the legend of the angel of death was being reborn in blood and gun smoke. Silver Creek was about to remind the territory why some names are spoken only in whispers, why some legends are best left to rest in peace. The morning sun climbed higher over Silver Creek, its harsh light illuminating a scene of carefully orchestrated chaos. Carson's and Mackenzie's men had scattered for cover, their initial confidence shattered by Collins' systematic dismantling of their forces. 7 men were down now, none dead, but each precisely wounded in ways that took them out of the fight, while their screams served to unnerve their companions. Marcus Blake, sheltering behind an overturned wagon with Carson and Mackenzie, was beginning to understand the depth of his miscalculation. "We need to regroup," he insisted, wiping sweat from his face. "Get the men organized, make a proper sweep of the town." "Organize them? How?" Mackenzie snarled, his guerrilla experience telling him they were in deep trouble. "Half of them are about to break and run. The other half can't shoot straight from fear. This isn't a man we're fighting. It's a ghost story come to life." A bullet whispered between them, so close it left a burning line across Carson's cheek before burying itself in the wagon's wood. The big outlaw leader touched the wound with trembling fingers, his face pale. "He could have taken my head just now," he whispered. "He's playing with us." Like a cat with mice, Colin's voice drifted from somewhere above them. "Teaching you the price of coming here, teaching you why some legends are best left alone." Another shot rang out, and one of the Whitfield brothers screamed as a bullet found his shoulder, the precise placement taking him out of the fight without ending his life. In the church tower, Deputy Morgan watched in fascination as his mentor's strategy unfolded. Collins wasn't just moving through the town, he was using every shadow, every angle, every patch of light to create an illusion of omnipresence. The outlaws never knew where the next shot would come from, their fear building with each carefully placed bullet. Dr. Sarah Maxwell worked steadily in her makeshift hospital, treating the wounded as they were brought in. Each injury told the same story. Precise, disabling wounds that could have been fatal if their shooter had wished it. "Your boss is an artist with that gun," she told one of Carson's men as she wrapped his shattered hand. "Be grateful he's choosing to teach rather than execute." The outlaw stared at her with wide eyes. "Teaching? Lady, he's destroying us piece by piece." "Yes," she agreed calmly, tightening the bandage, "and making sure each of you lives to spread the story. Clever man." Outside, Tommy Blake had finally cracked under the pressure. The youngest Blake brother broke from cover, running for his horse. "I'm done," he screamed. "This is suicide." He made it 3 steps before a bullet kicked up dust between his feet, freezing him in place. "Going somewhere, boy?" Collins materialized from the shadows of an alley, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the tense silence. He looked exactly like what he was, not an aging sheriff, but death incarnate in a badge. "Leaving your brothers to face judgment alone?" Tommy's hand twitched toward his gun, but Collins' cold smile stopped him. "That would be your last mistake," the older man said quietly. "You've got 2 choices now. Surrender and live. Maybe learn something about loyalty, or draw and meet whatever god you believe in." From their position behind the wagon, Marcus Blake watched in helpless rage as his younger brother slowly raised his hands. 2 of Mackenzie's men took the opportunity to make their own break, spurring their horses hard toward the south end of town. They made it halfway before more shots rang out, not from Collins this way, but from the church tower, where Deputy Morgan had been waiting for just such an attempt. "Your boys learned well," Mackenzie commented, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "Got us boxed in proper." Old John appeared from nowhere, his movements still showing his cavalry training as he efficiently disarmed and bound Tommy Blake. More townspeople were emerging now, armed with rifles and shotguns, taking up positions Collins had clearly prepared in advance. This whole town was a trap, Carson realized suddenly. Every building, every shadow. He's been planning this for years. 15 years, Collins agreed, his voice drifting from a new position. Watching, waiting, knowing that sooner or later evil men would bring violence to my home. But this time, a shot took down another of Mackenzie's men trying to line up a rifle shot from a second-story window. This time I had something worth protecting, something worth... Marcus Blake felt the last threads of his control slipping away. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was an education in terror, a lesson being written in blood and fear. His carefully gathered force of hardened killers was being systematically dismantled by a legend they'd thought safely buried in the past. "Last chance," Collins called out, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Surrender now, face territorial justice and live. Continue this fight." Another shot emphasized his point, disarming yet another outlaw with surgical precision. Well, even angels run out of mercy eventually. In his jail cell, James Blake listened to the chaos outside, a calm acceptance settling over him. The Angel of Death hadn't gone soft during his years as a sheriff. He'd simply been waiting, preparing, transforming an entire town into a weapon that could be used to trap and destroy men like them. The legend hadn't faded. It had evolved into something even more terrifying. The morning wasn't yet half over, and already the story of Silver Creek was being written in a way that would be whispered about in saloons for decades to come. The tale of how the Angel of Death awoke from his slumber and reminded the territory why some names should only be spoken in prayer. The sun had reached its zenith over Silver Creek, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance with deadly purpose. Marcus Blake, his carefully assembled force now in shambles, felt the noose of fate tightening. More than half his men were down, their wounds precisely placed to disable without killing. 6 others had surrendered, throwing down their weapons after watching Collins systematically dismantle their companions. The remainder huddled behind what cover they could find, jumping at shadows and flinching at every sound. Carson, his face streaked with blood from his grazed cheek, had lost his usual swagger. "This can't go on," he muttered, checking his dwindling ammunition. "He's not just beating us, he's writing a story that'll be told in every saloon from here to Texas." "That's exactly what he's doing," Mackenzie replied grimly. "Every man he wounds instead of kills becomes a witness. Every survivor becomes a messenger. The Angel of Death isn't just fighting us, he's rebuilding his legend." A bullet sparked off the wagon wheel beside them, making both men flinch. "Getting sloppy with your shooting, Carson." Colin's voice drifted from somewhere above. "Fear'll do that to a man. Makes his hands shake, his aim waver, makes him forget everything he knows about survival." Marcus Blake felt something snap inside him. Standing suddenly, he roared into the deadly silence of the street. Face me like a man, you ghost-riding coward, or are you only brave when you're hiding in shadows?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, like a spirit materializing from desert heat, Collins appeared in the middle of the street. He moved with the liquid grace of a mountain lion, his worn duster catching the wind, both colts riding easy on his hips. "Brave words," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. "But bravery without wisdom is just another word for suicide. Still, if you want to face death standing up—" He spread his hands slightly. "Here I am." Marcus stepped out from behind the wagon, his own gun hand steady despite the fear coursing through him. This was what he'd wanted, a straight fight, man to man, the kind of duel that became legend. But as he met Collins' eyes, he realized his mistake. The Angel of Death hadn't agreed to this challenge out of any sense of honor or bravado. This too was part of his lesson. "Before you draw," Collins said calmly, "you should know something. Your brother James figured it out in my jail cell." "Want to tell him, James?" From his cell window, James Blake's voice carried clearly. "He's not giving you a chance to die like a man, Marcus. He's making you an example. Win or lose, this moment will be told and retold until it becomes myth." "Smart boy," Collins nodded. "You see, Marcus, legends don't grow from quick draws and fair fights. They grow from moments like this, when a man's pride makes him forget everything he knows about survival." The street had gone deathly quiet. Even the wounded had fallen silent, watching the tableau unfold. Deputy Morgan, still in his church tower perch, held his breath. Dr. Sarah Maxwell stepped out onto the boardwalk, her medical bag clutched tight, knowing she'd be needed regardless of the outcome. Marcus Blake felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the desert heat. Every instinct screamed at him to back down, to surrender like the others, but pride and fear had trapped him in this moment like a rabbit in a snake's gaze. "Last chance," Collins offered quietly. "Throw down your gun, face the law's justice, live to see another sunrise. Or draw and become just another sentence in the story of the Angel of Death." For a moment, it seemed Marcus might choose wisdom over pride. His gun hand trembled slightly, his face showing the war between survival and ego. Then, with a speed born of desperate fear, he went for his weapon. He never cleared leather. Collins' draw was like lightning striking, too fast for the eye to follow, too deadly to survive. 2 shots rang out as one, and Marcus Blake's gun went spinning away, along with most of his trigger finger. He fell to his knees, clutching his maimed hand, staring up at the legend who had ended his reign of terror with surgical precision. "You could have killed me," he gasped through the pain. "Death is easy," Collins replied, his gun still smoking. "Living with the lesson is harder." He raised his voice to address the remaining outlaws. "Your leaders are down. Your force is broken. I've spent the morning teaching you the price of bringing violence to my town. Now you have a choice. Surrender and live, or continue this fight and meet the angel of death that your predecessors knew, the one who didn't believe in leaving witnesses." The clatter of dropping weapons sounded like rainfall on the dusty street. Even Carson and Mackenzie, hardened killers with prices on their heads, recognized when a legend had become reality. One by one, they stepped out with their hands raised, their faces showing a mixture of fear and awe. Old John and the townspeople moved in to secure the prisoners, while Dr. Maxwell began treating Marcus Blake's wound. Deputy Morgan descended from his perch, looking at his mentor with new understanding. "You never needed help, did you?" he asked quietly. "You could have handled them all alone." Collins holstered his smoking Colt with practiced ease. "Could have," he agreed. "But then it would have just been another story about the angel of death. This way, it's about more than that. It's about a town that stood up to evil, about good people who refused to be victims." He looked around at the community he'd protected for 15 years, at the citizens who had become more than just townspeople. They had become his reason for being more than just a legend. "The angel of death was a lonely legend," he said softly. "Sheriff Collins has something better, a home worth protecting, people worth fighting for. Sometimes the best way to honor a legend is to let it evolve into something new." The aftermath of what would become known as the Judgment of Silver Creek unfolded like ripples in a desert pond. By sunset, Carson, Mackenzie, and their surviving men were secured in every available cell and makeshift lockup in town. Dr. Sarah Maxwell had treated 17 wounded outlaws, each bearing the precise marks of Collins' handiwork. Disabled but alive, every one of them destined to carry both scars and stories of their encounter with the legend they'd foolishly awakened. In his office, Collins sat at his desk, methodically cleaning his Colts as Deputy Morgan looked on. The transformation that had overtaken him during the fight was slowly fading, like storm clouds clearing after rain. His hands had resumed their slight tremor, his shoulders once again showing the stoop of age. But his eyes retained that dangerous gleam, a reminder that some legends never truly fade. "You know they'll talk," Morgan said quietly. "Every man you wounded, every outlaw who surrendered, they'll spread the story across the territory." Collins nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That's the point, Will. Fear can be a more powerful peacekeeper than any badge. The angel of death wasn't just about killing evil men. It was about making other evil men think twice before following that path." James Blake, still in his cell but now sharing it with his brother Marcus, spoke up. "You've been planning this for years, haven't you? Setting up the town, preparing the battleground, waiting for the day violence would find its way here." 15 years, Collins agreed, not looking up from his work. "When I came here, I was tired of being death's messenger. Thought I could leave that part of me behind, just be a simple sheriff." He paused, checking the action on one of his Colts. "But wisdom comes with age. Sometimes the best way to protect something isn't to hide what you are. It's to make sure the wrong people know exactly who they're dealing with." Mayor Walsh entered the office, his face showing the strain of the day's events, but also a new understanding. "The Army patrol from Fort Grant will be here tomorrow to take the prisoners. The territorial marshal is coming personally. Seems he's quite interested in meeting the man who captured both the Blake gang and Carson's outfit in one morning. Collins carefully wrapped his second Colt in its oiled cloth. Tell him he's meeting Sheriff Mike Collins, nothing more. The angel of death did his work today. Now he can rest again. Will he? Dr. Maxwell asked from the doorway. She'd finished treating the last of the wounded, her sleeves still showing bloodstains from her work. Or will others come, drawn by the very legend you've reawakened? Some will, Collins admitted. Young guns looking to make a name, outlaws wanting to test themselves against the legend, but they'll find something different here. He looked around at the office, at the town beyond its windows, at the people who had stood with him. They won't find a lone angel of vengeance. They'll find a community that knows how to defend itself, good people who've learned to stand against evil. Old John appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, his cavalry bearing still evident in his movements. Reminds me of something you said during the war, sir, about how the strongest fortress isn't the one with the highest walls, but the one where every defender knows their part. The night deepened outside as Silver Creek began to return to normal, though changed in subtle ways. Shopkeepers reopened their doors, the saloon resumed business, and people emerged to share their stories of the day's events. But there was a new confidence in their movements, a quiet pride in knowing they had faced violence and emerged stronger. Tommy Blake, the youngest brother, asked to speak with Collins alone. When they brought him from his temporary cell in the storeroom, his face showed the impact of the day's lessons. "I want to make a deal," he said quietly. "I'm young enough to serve my time and start fresh, but I need to understand, need to learn. How to be a different kind of man," Collins finished for him. "That's the hardest lesson of all, boy. But understanding you need to learn it. That's the first step." As midnight approached, Collins stood on his office porch with Sarah Maxwell, watching the quiet street where so much blood had been shed just hours before. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I first treated your wounds all those years ago, I thought you were just another man carrying old scars. Now I understand. Some scars are meant to be seen, meant to tell a story. Every scar is a lesson," Collins agreed. "The ones we carry and the ones we give. Today's work will leave scars on a lot of men, but they're the kind that teach rather than just hurt." The moon rose over Silver Creek, painting the town in silver light and deep shadows. In cells and makeshift hospitals, hardened men nursed their wounds and contemplated their brush with legend. In saloons across the territory, riders were already spreading the word. The angel of death still lived, still dealt justice. But now he had something more precious than vengeance. He had a home worth defending, people worth protecting, and that made him more dangerous than ever. Deputy Morgan, making his evening rounds, understood finally what his mentor had been teaching him all these years. It wasn't just about keeping the peace or upholding the law. It was about standing as a bulwark against chaos, about being the kind of legend that makes evil men hesitate and good people stand taller. The story of Silver Creek would grow in the telling, becoming part of the territory's mythology. But the true lesson wasn't about one man's skill with a gun, or even about the return of a dreaded legend. It was about how legends can evolve, how a man of violence could find peace without sacrificing his ability to protect it, and how a small frontier town became the place where even angels learn new ways to deal justice. The angel of death had indeed returned, but he'd brought something more powerful than fear. He'd brought hope. And in the end, that would be his most enduring legacy. A month after the judgment of Silver Creek, the town had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The territorial marshal's office had posted a permanent deputy station there, though everyone knew it was more for show than necessity. No outlaw band would dare trouble a town protected by the Angel of Death, especially now that the legend had been reborn even stronger than before. The army patrol had come and gone, taking with them a string of prisoners whose stories would spread across the frontier like wildfire. Carson and Mackenzie, along with the Blake brothers, faced long sentences in territorial prison, all except Tommy Blake, who'd been granted leniency in exchange for his testimony and genuine desire for redemption. Dr. Sarah Maxwell found herself treating different kinds of injuries now, the routine accidents and ailments of a peaceful town rather than gunshot wounds. But she kept the church basement ready, understanding that peace, like everything in the frontier, required constant vigilance. "You know what's remarkable," she said to Collins one evening as they shared coffee on his office porch. "Not one of those men died that day. Every shot you fired was precise, deliberate, meant to wound rather than kill." Collins nodded slowly, his aged hand steady around his coffee cup. "Death is final," he said quietly, "but a man who lives with a reminder of his mistakes, who carries the story of his defeat, he teaches others without you having to fire a single shot." The legend grew in the telling, as such stories do. In saloons from Texas to California, men spoke in hushed tones about Silver Creek's defender. But the story had changed from the old tales of the Angel of Death. Now they spoke of a different kind of legend, one who defended rather than hunted, who chose mercy over vengeance when possible, but whose justice was no less absolute. Deputy Will Morgan had grown into his role, carrying himself with new confidence. He understood now what Collins had been teaching him all along, that true strength came not from the gun on your hip, but from the principles in your heart and the community at your back. Old John, still tending his livery stable, became something of a storyteller. "You all think you know about the Angel of Death," he'd tell wide-eyed visitors, "but you don't know the half of it. I saw him during the war, saw him that day in Silver Creek. Man never changed, just found something better than vengeance to fight for." Mayor Walsh had a new silver star cast for Collins, this one inscribed with both his name and the date of the battle. "Some memories," he said as he presented it, "deserve to be preserved in more than just stories." But perhaps the most profound change was in Collins himself. He no longer tried to hide what he was, no longer pretended to be just an aging lawman. The slight tremor in his hands would come and go. The stoop in his shoulders would appear and vanish, depending on what the moment required. He was both men now, the quiet sheriff and the deadly legend, and the town was safer for it. 1 year to the day after the battle, a young man rode into Silver Creek. He carried himself with the uncertain air of someone seeking something, though he wasn't sure what. Deputy Morgan found him at the sheriff's office, asking for Mike Collins. "My father," the young man said, "told me stories about the Angel of Death, about how he hunted down the men who killed our family when I was just a baby, said he moved like a ghost, dealt justice like divine wrath. But he also said the angel showed mercy when he could, gave men a chance to choose a better path." Collins studied the young man thoughtfully. "Your father survived then? Learned from his mistake?" The young man nodded. "Gave up the outlaw life, raised me honest. Said he owed it to the man who shot him in the hand instead of the heart, who taught him that some legends exist to guide men toward light rather than just deliver them to darkness." As the young man rode away, Collins stood on his porch with Sarah Maxwell and Will Morgan, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple. "You know they'll keep coming," Sarah said softly, "some seeking wisdom, some seeking trouble." "Let them come," Collins replied, his voice carrying the weight of both his personas, the gentle sheriff and the deadly legend. "Silver Creek will teach them what they need to learn, one way or another." The story of the Angel of Death had indeed evolved. No longer was it just a tale of vengeance and fear, of justice dealt in darkness. Now it was a story of protection and redemption, of a legend who found something worth more than retribution, a home to defend, people to protect, and a legacy that would echo across the territory for generations to come. As night fell over Silver Creek, bringing with it the cool desert winds and the first stars, the town settled into its new identity. It was no longer just another frontier settlement. It was the place where legends came to rest, where justice wore both a kind face and a deadly hand, and where even angels could learn new ways to watch over their flock. The Angel of Death still rode the territories, but now his legend carried a different message. Sometimes the deadliest predator is the one who chooses when not to kill, and the strongest guardian is the one who fights not for vengeance, but for home. Next story coming up right after this one, the narrator concluded, and you won't want to miss it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because we've got something special lined up for tomorrow.